The European Championship ends with ugly scenes at Wembley.
People on these stairs are meant to be in the seats, but you've got tailgaters in the seats.
We'll bring you the stories from inside the unrest as ticketless fans force their way into the final.
There were thugs basically trying to storm the gates. There was no policing of people coming up the gate one. So one guy who said, look, you haven't got a ticket, you should go, got elbowed in the face. It's a horrible atmosphere.
On Sports Unlocked, the fallout from shameful scenes as England lost to Italy, the racist abuse faced by England players, and where this all leaves the English-led bid to host the 2030 World Cup. We will also, though, celebrate Italy's triumph. They're the new European champions. Hello and welcome to the podcast delving deeper behind the sports news headlines. This is a Sport Unlocked analysing the fallout from the end of the European Championship. There was Italy's triumph, but it's a final that will also be remembered for those ugly scenes involving England fans. I'm Rob Harris from the Associated Press, and at Wembley in the thick of it with me was Tariq Panja from the New York Times, and of course we're joined on the pod by Martyn Ziegler from the Times, who we saw at Wembley as well during the semi-finals. Welcome all. It's certainly a lot to talk through in this week's episode.
Hi, Rob. Hi, Tariq. Good to be with you. Yes, I mean, a European Championships, which was probably one of the most complicated tournaments ever undertaken. But actually, the biggest problems are very much local issues, weren't they, at Wembley with the final, and some serious questions to answer as a result of that, I think, Tariq.
Yeah, real shocking scenes, really. And you got the sense that some of it might have been predictable. Real febrile atmosphere there from Wembley Way, that big thoroughfare that goes from the Wembley Park Underground station to pretty much the entrance of Wembley Stadium itself. About 15-minute walk in a straight line. That would give you the idea of, people who have not been to Wembley, the idea of how big that boulevard is. It's absolutely crammed full of supporters, both with tickets and without tickets, and drinking heavily from the morning. It was an 8 o'clock kickoff, and sadly, predictably, things got a little out of control, maybe a bit more than a little out of control. This stadium, the game, will be remembered for things that happened off the field. There was 2 or 3, maybe even more attempts of stampeding fans, gaining entry into the stadium, breaking gates, breaking doors, injuring themselves and creating a real health hazard there. The attendance was, on paper, this extended 66,500 because of the UEFA agreement with the British government. But if you were there, it was far more than that. There were people spinning out the aisles. There were certain areas, particularly behind the goals, that looked quite dangerous, with people really crammed in, cheek by jowl. And this is in a country that has had its, sad history of some disasters in their football stadiums. It was really troubling. Rob, how did you find it?
Yeah, I mean, it seems to be something that's actually been brewing over the course of the Euros, that we've seen very normal scenes that perhaps shouldn't be existing at the moment under the ongoing coronavirus restrictions, which are being phased out in the next week or so. But we've seen thousands of fans gathering near Wembley by the arena, close to the main entrances. And Wembley is a very different place from when it first opened in 2007. It's still seen as the desired venue of choice for organisations like UEFA for games, but it's so crowded, isn't it? The area around the stadium now. There aren't the vast open spaces that allow for crowd control, even for large barriers. There's the apartment blocks, the retail outlet that is right up close to the Wembley entrance. So it was always striking to me, how would they cope with major tournament infrastructure? And as we saw with the final, when fans decided they want to try to find a way in, England fans, the security wasn't very significant. We didn't get the high fences that we've seen at tournaments in recent years. It was a pretty weak front line, just stewards. And I think in part, because fans knew there was more than 20,000 empty seats because of the pandemic restrictions on the crowd at Wembley, it probably gave that incentive just to try to find a way in to get a seat. When England are playing their first men's final for 55 years, you can sort of see the incentive. And of course, there is that connection with history. The 1923 FA Cup final, the first game at Wembley, the White Horse final, known because of the policing in terms of the surge of fans trying to get in to see the occasion. So, it's not something unique to these modern times, but it seemed to me that actually during these Euros, why the police didn't do something to prevent big crowds building right close to the entrance in the open space by the arena. And some fans were disgusted by what they witnessed, and Tariq heard from some of them.
Basically, I've seen entering here, there were thugs basically trying to storm the gates. There was no policing of people coming up the gate one, so there was no COVID. But no one's checked my COVID test. When we were in here, there were people standing in the aisles with tickets, sitting in other people's seats. People have left, and then there was violence.
What sort of violence did you see?
So one guy who said, "Look, you haven't got a ticket, you should go." Got elbowed in the face.
He's been there for 45 minutes with everybody going. We can't. You can't get rid of them. He was so drunk, and nobody did anything. Are you not going to stay for the rest?
No, I'm going.
Why are you leaving?
I just think a sporting occasion like this is about enjoyment and the atmosphere. It's not about violence. It's violence.
Sorry.
It's a horrible.
You could just hear in his voice how crestfallen, how depressed, how despondent he was, and his friend who was with him. These were two men in their early 60s, huge sports fans. That they wouldn't have been more than maybe 5 or 6 years old, if that, when England won the World Cup. This was a huge moment for them, like for everyone else. They were just so sad. They just didn't want to be there anymore. They didn't care who won or who lost the game. The entire evening had been destroyed. And that's just a couple of people I bumped into around this sort of 60-minute mark. When you hear stories of other fans, particularly those with children who left the stadium as well, it just leaves such a nasty taste for everyone. Because win or lose, that probably is the biggest occasion many people would have ever been to. Sad it had to end that way.
Yeah, and I mean, actually, it includes some people who were caught up in the trouble. The son of the Italy coach Robert Mancini, he had to watch the first half actually sitting on the steps of rather than in the stadium. Families of England players were caught up, and they had to actually run away because some of the fans who stormed through one of the gates. Punching and kicking, and they were terrified, apparently.
UEFA on Tuesday did appoint an ethics and disciplinary investigator to conduct a wider investigation into all the actions of fans inside and outside Wembley at the final. They have already levelled some charges at the English FA. That's over the pitch invasion, objects being thrown, Italy's national anthem being jeered, and fireworks being set off. And these are investigations into a series of events that we have witnessed and have a real insight into.
Interesting. I mean, Tariq, you actually went to one of the semi-finals amongst the supporters, and you actually tweeted that there were more people in the stadium than there should be because people had gained access illegally. I mean, when this was put to the authorities actually the next day, they were insistent it couldn't have happened. So I think there was fair warning, wasn't there, that trouble was brewing like this. And yet, seeing some of the videos of it, the police seemed nowhere, the stewards were outnumbered, the fencing was absolutely pathetic in terms of what was needed. People were on the floor, being stamped on as people running over them. I mean, not surprisingly, there's people are saying there's going to be a big review of what happened, but it does feel that the warnings were there, and from you, Tariq.
Yeah. Ziggs, I was surprised with the reaction. There are people who say, "Oh, well, I didn't see anything like that," but so you sometimes have to question your own sanity when people are denying something that you've witnessed and you've experienced. And that was the Danish game was very instructive. Like for me, obviously. The three of us have a privilege mostly of when we attend major events of having going to the press area and the access is much easier. The mag and bag, etc., that we go through is different to everybody else. However, doing this was really, really interesting. First of all, there was the COVID checks that's supposed to take place for this particular tournament. Either, you've got your vaccination proof or you've had a lateral flow test, but there were so many people rushing in trying to get into the stadium. The infrastructure, the people could not manage to check everyone. People were flowing in. The next thing that happened is these tickets for the Euros, they're on your telephone, on your smartphones, and you're supposed to sort of wave them at an electronic turnstile that isn't manned by an operator. And then if you've got a ticket, the turnstile opens and you go through. The thing I saw is that with one ticket, 2 or 3 people would surge through at the same time. And this was, again, to remind everyone, the Danish game on the Wednesday. After that, there's supposed to be a search. And if a steward has seen people do anything like that, they're supposed to sort of question them a bit. The chap in front of me, he clearly didn't have a ticket. The steward challenged him and he just ran away. And it was so busy in there that the poor steward, let's just give everyone an idea of these stewards as well. These aren't professional security consultants or anything like that. These are people on largely minimum wage, about £9 an hour, a bit more than minimum wage maybe, £9 to £11. And they're not trained for some of this stuff at the scale it was. Then once you get into the stadium, you'll find there could be 3 or 4 burly guys or whoever in the area that you're supposed to be sitting in. And, if you ask them, you can't challenge them to say, look, these are your seats. They are going to want to stay there. And that was the experience of Wednesday. People crammed in.
Well, let's take a listen to what happened when you caught up with one of the stewards at Wembley on Sunday as all the mayhem was unfolding.
No one's been able to move. People are basically having it people on these stairs are meant to be in the seats. But you've got tailgaters in the seats.
So it does come back to the question about how should big games be secured? Should they be using stewards? Should there be more police? We see volunteers who are doing, obviously, the jobs for nothing, yet they're key to the security and safety of these events. Do they need more professional security people to be policing stadiums like this at a big tournament?
I don't think you need that necessarily. I don't think it's financially viable in many respects. I do think that the police, when I was at the Italy-Spain semi-final, there were van loads of police, they're sitting in their vans, waiting for any to be called into any action. I guess as some sort of reserve force if there's any trouble. What you really needed was police manning the entrances and helping the stewards and preventing this happening. I think they're going to have to look at that seriously if they're going to hold major events at Wembley, which threaten to have the same sort of thing here, because what people will do with stewards, they won't do if the police are there. That's absolutely for sure.
Yeah, well, one of the other things that they got away with it slightly is, Rob alluded to it, that the capacity was about 25,000 less than Wembley can hold. And that gives you a bit of wriggle room. But and that still meant when those people surged in, it was tight, but not in some areas there was space to move around. Imagine that stadium was at capacity and this happened. You're looking at potentially a disaster. Talking to other people working at that stadium, they were using words like crush, like fans being boxed in, like people falling down and their shoes coming off, being unable to move. Now, that has some horrible connotations with football in the United Kingdom, doesn't it, guys?
Yeah, and we thought some of these days were behind us, modern stadiums, all-seater, and an established way of security. But it shows actually perhaps when you get such a huge crowd like that for an occasion of the type England has not witnessed for 55 years, that some of the bad practices, the dangers will return.
Just seemed like the mood was also a bit nasty, wasn't it? Because the drinking, there was open drug use as well. People were just riled up. It was different outside the stadium on Sunday, perhaps compared to some of the other days. It just seemed there was a lot more people out for trouble as well from the get-go, didn't it?
And you listen to some of the songs, and a lot of them are about drinking or drug use. You know, the Harry Maguire song. There's also "Don't Take Me Home" with lyrics inserted about, well, sniff all your gear. And, you know, it does reflect a certain fan culture, doesn't it? Perhaps that's why, actually, there is such an embrace of Sweet Caroline over recent weeks in the stadium. It is actually more of a joyful sort of family experience of a song, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's always been a problem for England. If you going back decades, it's always been a sort of had an attraction for a certain sort of right wing supporter. No surrender songs. I mean, it's amazing. More than 20 years after the Good Friday peace agreement, we're still having people singing "No Surrender" to the IRA. I mean, it's just mind-boggling. Who are these people singing these, and why? But it's just, to me, it's just a throwback to this culture which people are reluctant to let go of, or they, the new breed want to embrace because they think it's macho or something like that. But and it probably doesn't help the whole sort of Brexit and culture wars issues that we've had. That's also maybe making people a bit more radicalised and contributing in a way to this sort of slightly nasty atmosphere that there was.
Yeah, well, Rob and I were commuting to one of the semi-finals together, and again, you mentioned anti-IRA lyrics in some of these chants. We were on a carriage, and it was anti-German stuff harking back to World War II. It's got nothing to do with any of this. This is what I find very strange. Like, is it really impossible to support your team in a full-throated way, give them all the support they need, without being nasty about the opponents or whoever else you want to be nasty about? You can still create a massive atmosphere inside the stadium, give your team all the advantages that brings, without being total morons.
Well, of course, the song you're referring to, of course, was 10 German Bombers, which is still sung about Nazi Germany in World War II after so many years. And obviously, we've had England and Gareth Southgate condemning England fans throughout this tournament, really. Started with them condemning the fans when they were booing players taking a knee. We also had it when fans started to boo opposition anthems. There was warnings, particularly ahead of the Germany game, to respect the opposition as well. I mean, these have been very different games at Wembley, where England have played 6 out of their 7 games because of the structure of the tournament. Very different because, of course, England is dominating the stands because away fans can't come in. But then I sat down with some other journalists at St George's Park ahead of the final with Gareth Southgate, and he did cause a bit of surprise with some of his comments when he was asked about what England meant to him and his sense of nationality. When he talked about, and I quote, "People have tried to invade us and we've had the courage to hold that back. You can't hide that some of the energy in the stadium against Germany was because of that." What did you make of those comments coming ahead of the final?
I mean, I think it's all that, there is I think people do think back of, their grandparents. People of a certain generation think that their grandparents fought in the war, and then that was a really important part of their lives growing up, and they kind of gives them some sort of national identity. So maybe that's what he was harking back to, Southgate. But I think what's quite interesting is, like, if you look at European football, Italy, Spain, France, most of the sort of ultra hooligan element is related to clubs. It's not so much related to the national teams. It's different with England. In England, it's not so much related to clubs anymore. It used to be, but it's now much more centred on the national team, I think. So I think that's why we're seeing these issues around England, and perhaps you don't get them in those other countries, but you perhaps do in Eastern Europe, where it is much more focused on nationalistic politics, perhaps.
And we have obviously had a lot of concern about the race abuse sent to the England players who missed the penalties in the shootout: Jadon Sancho, Marcus Rashford and Bukayo Saka. A familiar thing we've covered across the pod is the inaction, the lack of determination, perhaps, of the social media firms to try to eradicate this abuse. Gareth Southgate on Monday did refer to actually maybe some of this does come from abroad, and we're not too sure of the identity of some of the abusers.
Yeah, that's correct. It does come from abroad. But just to get before we go into that social media stuff, it's so ingrained. It's certainly like if you're for me, I'm a person of colour, I guess, and you're sitting there in a penalty shootout, right, and you're watching it, and you're thinking, and I hate to say this, but is what I was thinking. Please don't let it be all the black guys who are going to miss this penalty because they're going to. You just know, and that's the sad thing about all this. It's so inevitable, and it's tragic, really, isn't it? That you know that those guys are going to miss the penalties, and they're going to get it worse than if someone else was. You just know it, and sadly, 3 of these guys missed a penalty, and predictably, this awful stuff just sort of gutter nonsense starts pouring out almost immediately, almost with glee by some of the people who are typing this stuff anonymously behind God knows what username, and off it goes. And we have this round of condemnation from across the board. Look, we've been doing this podcast since, well, episode 26 now, and I think we've talked about this a couple of times. We had the official from the PFA on as well, talking about these issues. And we're just going to go round and round in circles, sadly. And this was a biggest high point, like you say, a massive game, 55 years, doesn't get bigger than this. And this is what we're talking about.
Well, we did have Boris Johnson condemning the abuse sent to the England players. We did have Priti Patel condemning the racism as well targeted at them. And we had the Labour deputy leader, Angela Rayner, saying that actually Boris Johnson and Priti Patel are like arsonists complaining about a fire they poured the petrol on. Total hypocrites, because of course they earlier in the tournament didn't really condemn England fans for booing taking a knee. In fact, Priti Patel said it was up to the fans what to do. She also called it gesture politics, taking a knee. Well, Tyrone Mings as well has spoken out too. He's not accepted at all the comments of Boris Johnson and particularly Priti Patel. He retweeted Priti Patel's comment saying she was disgusted about what she called vile race abuse on social media. Tyrone Mings said, "You don't get to stoke the fire at the beginning of the tournament by labelling our anti-racism message as gesture politics and then pretend to be disgusted when the very thing we're campaigning against happens."
Yeah, I mean, that was a really strong post by Tyrone Mings. Quite unusual, isn't it, for a footballer to get directly involved in really against a politician like that, but increasingly so, and good thing too. We had Tracy Crouch, the former sports minister, on the other day talking about the taking the knee and the reaction of some of her Conservative colleagues, saying she just could not understand why they were taking this position, and she thought that they just didn't get it until they don't. And Tyrone Mings absolutely right to call this out, because you can't say one thing 1 week and then 2 weeks later saying, "Oh, you're disgusted about it," because I mean that's exactly why people have been taking the knee, because they are being hit with this torrent of racist abuse. And I mean, I thought the same, Tariq, and I just about the fact that 3 black players all going to miss. And I thought, that is just going to be open season for these attention seekers, racists, whatever they are. I mean, whatever motivates them, it's an opportunity, isn't it? And it's something which the social media platforms have to deal with, but I think there are sort of wider societal issues too as well. And the international element is something which I think, again, the social media platforms perhaps have to concentrate on more than anybody else, because if you've got somebody sitting in Russia or America deciding they want to target an English player, it's very difficult for them to face action from the British authorities, isn't it? Well, it's impossible.
You're right. Yeah, there was actually a case recently where the Premier League took action against, successfully prosecuted or helped prosecute an individual in Singapore who sent racial abuse to the Brighton striker Neil Mopay. Again, but it's hard, isn't it? You think how many thousands messages, etc., wherever they're coming from. It's like I say, it's not only a UK problem. But just going back to Tyrone Mings for a second, it just shows you how hurt he is as an individual. He's a man. Yes, he's a football player. Yes, he's a Aston Villa stalwart, England player, etc. But he's a human being, and he's probably felt the effects of this kind of dog whistle politics. He's one of the people, him and his teammates, they're the ones who open their social media feeds and have to see it. You can say, well, ignore it. It's easy to say if you don't get it. And they're the ones who might get it in the street as well. And they've got every right to come back at people they think are stoking this stuff, whether it's a government minister or anyone else. Brave may be, but it's correct. This is a man who clearly feels that people are sowing these dangerous seeds of division in this country, and he's calling them out. Good luck to him.
And very much we're seeing the players at odds with the values they're extolling with those of some of their fans. And it's something that I actually asked Gareth Southgate about on Monday.
Does it frustrate you, and are you reflecting on how to tackle how you've got players who've generated such pride from the country during these last few weeks, but you're still having to deal and address the fact there are fans who are being disrespectful, offensive and violent, and not the image that you want, and certainly completely counter to the image that the players have presented?
Yeah, look, we can't control that. We can only set the example that we believe we should, and represent the country in the way that we feel you should when you're representing England. And everybody has to remember when they support the team that they also represent England and should represent what we stand for. So I think the players have done that brilliantly, and we can only continue to try to affect the things that we can, but we have, I think, had a positive effect on lots of areas of society, but we can't affect everything. Other people have responsibilities in those areas, and we've all got to work collectively to constantly improve those things.
Interesting that by Southgate. And just to say, clearly Tyrone Mings' actions have really resonated, because he's had something like 500,000 people on Twitter have replied or quoted or liked that tweet from him, which is, absolutely unprecedented. I think that sort of reaction. So maybe what his message he's putting out there is having a really strong effect. Let's hope so.
And the FA really has encouraged and given the space for players to speak out on political and social issues during this tournament and in recent years in a way that they didn't perhaps in years gone by, and would put a sort of shield and sort of discourage them from saying anything controversial at all, particularly while on England duty.
Yeah, and I suppose the environment, the time we live in, helps with that as well. The platforms that we're disparaging are also opportunities for these guys to talk directly to the public in ways that previous players, high-profile figures, weren't able to do before, and they've embraced them fully to speak up for their causes. Marcus Rashford has been perhaps the exemplar of this, but the others are there too. Raheem Sterling has spoken up very eloquently at times over issues that he's concerned about, particularly around racism. So yeah, back to the fallout of what happened on Sunday night. This is a really awful moment for England to be pushing a World Cup bid with the other home nations, the Republic of Ireland, isn't it, guys?
It's funny because it's like it sort of goes up and down, the England and Ireland World Cup bid. So you'd say at the sort of start of the year, if they were sort of behind Spain, Portugal, then they sort of leapt up in a reckoning after the Super League debacle, because the Spanish FA's basically in kowtowing to Barcelona and Real Madrid, and UEFA much more in favour of a British and Irish bid, I would say. And then there was a bit of around the Champions League final, they weren't able to get the exemption, so that went to Portugal. That was back in their favour. Then with the Euro 2020 climax, giving the exemptions to the UEFA VIPs, that was good for the British and Irish bid, and now this again, showing that they're having these problems with the actual final itself. I think there's so much up and down. You can't take one incident or one thing in isolation. I think it's a really, really difficult one to call. I just think it's going to be one of the most interesting sports news stories of the next couple of years, because there is they're both UEFA made it clear they want one European bid, so it's either going to be Britain and Ireland or Spain and Portugal, and both of them have their pluses and their minuses, and it's going to be absolutely intriguing to see which way it goes.
Perhaps what's interesting is we're seeing Boris Johnson particularly try to embrace the bid and promote the bid. Yet, obviously, we've got players like Tyrone Mings going against the government. What would happen if there was some sort of reception at some point, held in Downing Street to celebrate reaching the finals after they've all come back from their holidays? We've seen during the Trump administration that players from sports teams didn't necessarily want to go to the White House sometimes. How much would some of these England players want to be associated with this government if it was part of a sort of wider bid? It's probably helped the fact that it is being pursued by the home nations along with Ireland. So it actually perhaps takes away from just being, say, Boris Johnson at the focal point of it. But it could be the case of England actually needing the other nations in the British Isles to help soften the image, and particularly as they're trying to rebuild from some of the damage caused by these violent scenes at the Euro 2020 final.
Yeah, absolutely. I think some of the fans of other countries, Welsh, the Scots particularly, they were kind of celebrated for some of the joy they brought to the tournament. Maybe you can push that. But the other thing that I'm concerned about was one of the kind of benefits, or one of the plus points of the British bid, is that it's this sense that everyone is welcome here. It's a very multicultural country. But then you think about some of the things we've seen, some of the language towards people of colour, and then even the songs towards opponents. Rob, the other day, we're going towards Wembley Stadium for the final, and you see Italian fans, and then you hear chants that are just anti-Italian. Nothing.
They were bizarre. It was like chanting against Tagliatelle, Lamborghinis, and things like that. I mean, we hadn't heard them before. What was interesting was the fact they seemed to spread across London wherever they were. It's like wildfire, just being offensive.
These were the Italians we're talking about, and it was as awful as it was. It just made my mind think, what if this is another country where some of the language would be more vitriolic, perhaps racist? And I remember when England had a series of playing against Turkey, they just kept being drawn together in the mid-2000s for European qualifiers or World Cup qualifiers. And I lived near Wembley at the time. My parents lived near there. And you would be on the tube on a match night going towards Wembley Stadium. And the area I grew up in, very multicultural, lots of Asian and black families in that neighborhood. And you'll see a train carriage shaking with football fans chanting things like, "I'd rather be a Paki than a Turk." And it really hurt, because this is our football team as well. But then you think, well, is it? If these guys are using you as the lowest of the low as a comparison for this ridiculous chant for Turkey. And, this is what a lot of people are thinking about, because the country is diverse, but you have to feel, are we all included? And then when you think about the players, these guys are talking about social justice. Some of them are clearly from minority backgrounds. It must be really hard for them to think, are we in common cause with these fans? What are they supporting? Because they're not supporting me, maybe. Some of them might be thinking they'd rather I'm not here. Raheem Sterling, perhaps England's player of the tournament. How would he feel with kind of the level of racism around the England team? And again, when you're trying to do a bid and you're trying to embrace the world, why would the world want to come to you?
And it's almost like the fans are happy enough to celebrate the team's success when a player like Sterling is delivering for them and giving them the results that they then can celebrate and go in the streets and be boisterous. But actually, they'll turn on them if there's something that they do they don't like. So it's very much a transactional relationship, isn't it, between the fans and the players, when it should actually be a harmonious one and a close bond as part of a united mission.
Going back to that, those Turkey matches, I remember actually UEFA actually sanctioned England for that. I think they were played at Sunderland, and they sanctioned England after fans were chanting that. So it is definitely something which has been around for a long time. I mean, I take your point, Tariq, but I do actually think, if you look at for example, Spain's racial attitudes. I mean, it's not that long ago that black players playing in Spain were regularly booed in the stadiums in a way that you actually don't see in England, and so I don't think that we are behind the Spanish in that. In fact, I'd say in England there's a strong argument that actually in terms of multiculturalism we're ahead of Spain. So. I know when you're feeling sort of like incredulous about the sort of responses we have, and you think that it's a disaster. It is, but it doesn't necessarily mean that we are sort of the worst in Europe and worse than our European rivals for the World Cup. It's just. It's just that it's just happened and it's very raw.
And yes, there has been criticism from the likes of Raheem Sterling about media coverage of black players in particular over the years. But I think we would say, particularly now, that actually these issues of racism, racial injustice, particularly in football, do actually get covered wider in our media in England than perhaps we see in some other European countries, where it isn't treated as seriously either by the sports leaders and probably in reality some of our media colleagues in some other parts of Europe.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Rob. The level of scrutiny on these issues from media in this country is far higher than you would see perhaps anywhere else in Europe. But at the same time, there are sections of the British media that have helped to whip up some of this sentiment that we're seeing unleashed on the terraces with England during this tournament and elsewhere. So it's a bit of yes, on the one hand, we scrutinise, or British media scrutinises this issue perhaps more than media elsewhere, but it'd be wrong, in fact, to say that they haven't had a hand in some sense stoking up some of the feelings.
And in fact, of course, the press boxes at these England games, often at England press conferences, are very white male dominated as well, because there is a diversity issue in the sports media.
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, ironically, one of the things which goes against a British and Irish bid-winning support in Europe is that a lot of the Eastern European countries are fed up, but with the English and the English media labelling them as racist, like Bulgaria, for example, and Montenegro. They feel that they're unfairly given this tag, and a lot of it is the English media or the English FA or English campaigners. It's their fault. So, interestingly, the fact that there is such a strong focus on anti-racism in this country is also a potential negative.
And of course, we're only 60 months or so away from potentially thousands of England fans flying out to Qatar for a World Cup there, a first World Cup in the Middle East, a different culture where England fans have never gathered before in such numbers. We did have a few Liverpool fans going out to Doha for the Club World Cup in 2019, but it is a potential area of concern given some of the behaviour of fans.
Yeah, I mean, it'd be really interesting to see how that works out, because I mean, Qatar, the World Cup there is not spread across the country as we're used to. This is effectively a World Cup taking place in one city. And if you're going to have tens of thousands of fans of all different parts of the world all coming together, some being on the slightly hooliganistic side of the fence, then it's potential for some trouble. But I imagine that maybe Qatar is not the sort of place you want to step out of line.
No, it's going to be very tight, like you say as well. It's about the size of Yorkshire, I think, Zeeks, where you're based. Imagine the entire World Cup taking place there, and all the supporters all in that place at one time. That it's a bit of a powder keg potentially, where I don't know, a match, a fraught match, or a draw that puts two very antagonistic rivals potentially off the field together. What may that bring? It's something that the Qataris and FIFA have had, I suppose, a long time to think about, given that will be 12 years from that fateful day when Sepp Blatter opened the envelope and plucked out Qatar, so that they probably know what's coming. But even when you know what's coming, it might be harder to deal with in real time, as maybe the fellows at Wembley found out.
Of course, Italy will be going to Qatar as European champions, having failed to qualify for the last World Cup. Perhaps in all this, we should just reflect slightly on Italy's own triumph, capping a now a 34-match unbeaten run by being crowned European champions for the second time.
Yeah, I mean, great from Roberto Mancini to get this team of not the interesting thing about it. It's a team of non-superstars, and he's got them very much being a sum of the parts rather than these star players. You don't have a Ronaldo, you don't have a Messi, or you don't even have a Harry Kane. You just have a conglomerate of players all playing extremely well, and the system works excellently. So actually, Mancini is probably the hero of this team.
And as we reflect on the end of this unique European Championship, stayed in 11 different countries across Europe. Tariq, what are your memories of the event?
From a football point of view, it was really exciting. There were so many goals, so many good goals as well. There was Patrick Schick. I was in Glasgow for Scotland's first game. It was a damp squib as far as they were concerned, but it was really brightened up with Patrick Schick scoring from pretty much the halfway line. And we've seen goals galore pouring in throughout the tournament. There have been shocks, etc. Yeah, in general, from a football point of view, it was an excellent tournament. We had kind of remarkable news stories as well, starting with Eriksen having a cardiac arrest. I mean, just it feels like years ago now when you go back to this. It's just been an insane tournament at that level. And we had obviously the disastrous handling of the situation over Pride by UEFA. And, I must say that it did end for me with the correct winner. Italy really lit the tournament up. For me, they were not in the front rank as favourites despite that unbeaten run. Martyn said they were more than the sum of his parts, and I think he's dead right. That team really played like a team and won like a team. It was nice to see them do that, and it was a real bear pit. They did it in at Wembley Stadium on Sunday night.
And an interesting story you did, Rob, about the fact that UEFA now considering expanding it from 24 to 32 teams. That's like 32 of the 55 UEFA nations. I mean, it's good in a way. It's a sort of cleaner tournament, but 32 out of the 55, the qualifying tournament then becomes a big problem.
Yeah, it looks like they'd have to overhaul qualifying completely, which obviously ties in the fact that they're looking at a new international calendar after 2024 anyway, and qualifying at the moment does create those one-sided games that aren't even particularly appealing to the sponsors and the TV companies anyway. So maybe something like the Nations League ultimately feeds into the qualification for the Euros, and that's a way of avoiding some of the less meaningful games in the calendar and creating more competitive games. One thing a 32-team Euros will do, it prevent that sort of third-place team in each of the groups waiting to see if they get one of those best spots to also go through with the top two from each group. So it might sort of smooth things out, but could be a good vote winner as well if when Alexander Sheffrin is seeking re-election, having found a way helping the smaller nations more. Of course, Gianni Infantino, the FIFA president, was at Wembley for the European Championship final, and he'd flown straight in from Brazil, where, not to forget, there was the Copa America final too, with Argentina ending their 28-year title drought.
Great sporting story. Argentina ends its title drought, and so does somebody else. Lionel Messi, finally, after all this anguish, after the almost victory at the 2014 World Cup inside the same Maracanã stadium, he manages to win a title with Argentina. Sadly, there were very few fans there. I think only a handful, maybe a couple of hundred from each side in that Cavernous Stadium. But the way he fell to his knees and was tears of joy just shows you how much it meant to him and how much some of these national team events mean to players who play for them.
Well, that's an uplifting way to bring a draw to an episode when we've had to really reflect on some of the uglier sides of football. And what a busy summer it is. We've still got the Olympics to come, but that wraps up the Copa America and the Euros, with the investigations ongoing into the fallout from the violence at Wembley. Well, in the midst of it all, it was great to see you guys at Wembley at points in the last week of the Euros, and good to reflect on everything that's been going on at the tournament.
Very good, guys. Have a good week.
Thank you.
Absolutely. And if any of you listeners have got any thoughts on episode 26 of Sport Unlocked, we're always grateful to receive them. You can message us on Instagram, Twitter and Facebook at Sport Unlocked. We're on email at sportunlockedpod@gmail.com. And most importantly, we're really grateful if you could rate, review and subscribe to us on whatever platform you get your pods on, and then we'll automatically drop into your feeds whenever there is a new episode, especially if it's sort of slightly out of sync like this week. But we've had a lot to reflect on, and we hope you enjoy the sports viewing in the days ahead, and we'll speak to you soon. Goodbye for now.